He gave you crumbs because, at the time, you were living from a place of quiet hunger, not for him specifically, but for validation, for reassurance, for the feeling of being chosen. Hunger changes perception. When someone is starving emotionally, even the smallest gesture feels like a feast, a delayed reply feels like anticipation, a half promise feels like hope, a fleeting compliment feels like love. And when hunger speaks louder than self-respect, the mind begins to justify what the soul already knows is insufficient. You didn't misunderstand his behavior. You understood it perfectly. You just convinced yourself that enduring less was the price of staying close. He learned quickly that you would remain even when effort disappeared. Not because he studied manipulation, but because human beings adapt to the environment they are allowed to live in. When warmth is always available, we stop noticing the fire. When forgiveness is endless, accountability disappears. He didn't wake up one day deciding to give you crumbs. He slowly reduced himself to the lowest version that still kept you there, and every time you stayed, every time you explained instead of walked away, every time you accepted inconsistency as complexity, you unknowingly taught him what was enough. This is the part that hurts the ego but heals the spirit. People don't treat us according to our potential, our intentions, or our depth. They treat us according to the boundaries we enforce. Love without boundaries is not devotion, it is self-abandonment. And self-abandonment always attracts those who benefit from it. You are not weak. You are loyal without discernment. You are patient without limits. You are giving without asking whether the exchange was balanced. Stoicism teaches that suffering often comes not from what others do to us, but from what we permit while hoping things will change. You told yourself stories to survive the imbalance. You said he was busy, wounded, confused, afraid of intimacy. You said timing was the issue, not effort. You told yourself that if you just loved harder, understood deeper, waited longer, he would finally see your value. But love does not need to be proven through endurance. That idea is a romanticized form of pain. Real connection does not require you to shrink, to wait in silence, or to accept uncertainty as a permanent state. When someone wants you in their life, clarity comes naturally. Confusion is usually a signal, not a mystery. At some point, crumbs begin to feel normal. That is the most dangerous phase. When disappointment becomes familiar, the nervous system mistakes it for safety. You stop expecting consistency because inconsistency is all you know. You stop asking for more because asking has never worked. You tell yourself you are strong for tolerating less, when in reality, strength would have been walking away. Stoic philosophy reminds us that dignity is not loud. It is quiet, firm, and unmoved by fear of loss. The moment you sacrifice dignity to keep someone, you have already lost yourself. He sensed that you would stay. People sense these things instinctively, not through words, but through energy. Your availability spoke louder than your needs. Your forgiveness spoke louder than your disappointment. Your presence after disrespect spoke louder than your tears. And so he relaxed. He stopped pursuing. He stopped proving. He stopped choosing. Not because you were unworthy, but because you made it unnecessary for him to rise. Comfort does not build character, and it does not build commitment either. This is not about blaming yourself. Stoicism is not about self-punishment. It is about radical responsibility. Responsibility is power. The moment you see your role clearly, you reclaim control over your future. You realize that you were not trapped, you were attached. You were not powerless, you were hoping. And hope, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes a slow form of self-betrayal. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. You suffered not only from what he gave, but from what you believed he might one day give. There was a part of you that knew this wasn't enough. It spoke quietly at first. In moments of loneliness, even when you were with him. In the heaviness after conversations that went nowhere. In the subtle exhaustion of always being the one who understood. But you silenced that voice because leaving felt more painful than staying. Stoicism teaches that pain is inevitable, but prolonged suffering is a choice. Staying where you are diminished is a daily decision, even when it feels like fate. You confused potential with reality. You fell in love with who he could be, not who he consistently showed himself to be. And potential is intoxicating because it keeps hope alive. But living on potential means postponing your life. It means loving a future version of someone while neglecting your present self. He lived comfortably in the gap. He didn't need to become more because you were already giving more. Why would he change when the current version of him still received your loyalty? Crumbs feel acceptable when you believe you are asking for too much. Somewhere along the way, you internalize the idea that wanting consistency, effort, and emotional presence was demanding. That needing reassurance made you needy. That expressing dissatisfaction made you difficult. So you learned to soften your needs until they barely existed. But Stoicism does not teach emotional suppression, it teaches emotional clarity. And clarity would have told you that your needs were not excessive, they were simply unmet. He didn't take advantage of you because you were kind. He took advantage because kindness without limits invites misuse. A Stoic heart is compassionate but disciplined. It gives freely but never at the expense of self-respect. You were generous with someone who had not earned access to that depth. And generosity, when given without discernment, becomes depletion. You started pouring from a cup that was never being refilled. When you accept crumbs, you silently communicate that you don't expect a full meal. And once that message is sent, it's hard to undo. He stopped seeing you as someone he had to rise for and started seeing you as someone who would adjust for him. That shift is subtle but devastating. Desire grows when there is something to lose. Effort grows when access is not guaranteed. You remove the risk, and with it, you remove the reason for him to invest. Yet, this phase was not meaningless. Stoicism reminds us that every experience is material for growth. This was the chapter where you learn the cost of self-abandonment, where you learn that love without self-worth turns into quiet suffering, where you learn that being understanding should never mean being invisible. These lessons carve wisdom into the soul, and wisdom is never wasted. You began to feel smaller, not because he diminished you, but because you were living beneath your values. When your actions contradict your inner truth, the soul responds with discomfort. That discomfort was not weakness, it was integrity trying to wake you up. Stoic philosophy teaches us to live in alignment with our principles, regardless of attachment or fear. The moment you compromised your principles to keep him, you began to lose peace. And peace, not love, is the true measure of a life well lived. He gave you crumbs because you were still there when he did. That is the truth, stripped of emotion and blame. But within that truth lies your liberation. Because the moment you recognize this, you also recognize that you have the power to change the pattern. Not by demanding more from him, but by demanding more from yourself. By refusing to participate in dynamics that require you to shrink. By choosing solitude over slow erosion. Stoicism teaches that we cannot control how others act, but we can control what we tolerate. Tolerance is not virtue when it costs you your self-respect. Endurance is not strength when it keeps you stuck. True strength is the willingness to walk away from what no longer honors you, even when attachment pulls you back. You were not asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. And more importantly, you were asking at the cost of your own dignity. This realization is painful, but pain that leads to clarity is a form of mercy. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you know your worth, crumbs will never again feel like a meal. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, the way all real power shifts do. There was no announcement, no dramatic goodbye, no final argument that declared you were done. It started the moment you stopped pouring your energy into a space that was never designed to hold it. You didn't plan to withdraw as a strategy. You were simply tired of explaining yourself to someone who benefited from not understanding you. And that exhaustion changed everything. When you stopped reaching out first, the silence felt uncomfortable at first, not because you missed him, but because you were breaking a pattern your nervous system had memorized. For so long, your worth had been tied to response, to reaction, to his availability. The absence of that rhythm felt like loss, even though what you were losing was only habit. Stoicism teaches that attachment often disguises itself as love, when in reality it is fear of emptiness. And emptiness terrifies those who have not yet learned to sit with themselves. He felt it before he understood it. People always do. Energy withdrawal creates a vacuum, and vacuums demand attention. The texts that once went unanswered by him were now unanswered by you. The emotional labor you once offered freely was no longer available. You didn't withdraw with anger, you withdrew with neutrality. And neutrality is far more unsettling than confrontation. Anger still shows care, silence shows acceptance of reality. He began replaying moments in his mind, trying to locate where things shifted. But nothing dramatic had happened. That was the problem. There was no clear mistake to apologize for, no obvious offense to correct. You had simply stopped adjusting. Stoicism emphasizes that when you remove yourself from what drains you, you don't need to explain. Your absence becomes the explanation. And for someone accustomed to your presence, that absence feels like a loss of control. What unsettled him most was not missing you, but missing the version of himself that felt powerful in your presence. When you were always available, always understanding, always forgiving, he held the upper hand without realizing it. Your withdrawal stripped that illusion away. Suddenly, he was the one waiting. Suddenly, uncertainty entered his world. And uncertainty awakens desire in those who were previously comfortable. He began reaching out more. Not with depth at first, but with curiosity. A check-in, a subtle probe, a message designed to test whether you were still there. Stoicism teaches that people reveal their intentions through patterns, not words. And his pattern showed confusion, not transformation. He wasn't yet seeking to meet you where you were, he was seeking to pull you back to where you had been. That is always the first response of someone who senses loss. You, on the other hand, were experiencing something unfamiliar. Calm, not happiness, not excitement, but calm. The calm that comes from no longer negotiating your worth. The calm that comes from not waiting for permission to feel secure. You began to reclaim your time, your attention, your inner space. And with that reclamation came clarity. You saw how much of your emotional energy had been invested in managing his comfort at the expense of your own. Stoicism does not romanticize revenge or validation. It teaches indifference to what no longer aligns. As you stepped into that indifference, he felt something close to panic. Not because he had suddenly discovered your value, but because he could no longer access it freely. Access is often mistaken for intimacy. Once access is removed, the illusion collapses. He began to think about you in moments when he once ignored you. In silence, your absence grew louder than your presence ever had. This is the paradox of attention. What is always available becomes invisible, and what is scarce becomes valuable. Stoicism recognizes this not as a tactic, but as a natural law of human behavior. You didn't manipulate scarcity. You simply stopped overgiving. The more grounded you became, the more restless he grew. He checked his phone more often. He reread old conversations, searching for emotional warmth he had once overlooked. He noticed your absence in places he had assumed you would always be. This was not love blooming, it was attachment awakening after complacency. And there is a crucial difference. Love seeks to give, attachment seeks to regain. You were no longer trying to be understood, you were no longer trying to prove your loyalty. That absence of effort changed the dynamic entirely. He could no longer rely on your emotional labor to stabilize his own uncertainty. And without that support, he was forced to confront something uncomfortable, himself. Stoicism teaches that discomfort is the doorway to growth, but only if one is willing to walk through it. Many turn back and look for distractions instead. He may have started imagining a future with you again, not because it had become clearer, but because it was now threatened. The idea of losing you activated fears that presence never did. This is why Stoicism warns against mistaking intensity for sincerity. Intensity often arises from fear, not commitment. And fear-driven desire fades as soon as security is restored. You felt the pull to respond, to explain, to reassure. Old patterns don't dissolve quietly. They tug at you, especially when the other person begins to show interest again. But you had learned something essential. Consistency matters more than words. You observed rather than reacted. You listened without abandoning yourself. And in that space, you saw clearly that his urgency was about loss, not alignment. Your silence was not a game, it was a boundary. And boundaries change relationships more than any conversation ever could. Stoicism teaches that boundaries are not punishments, they are expressions of self-respect. You were no longer available for emotional half measures. You were no longer willing to return to a dynamic that required you to shrink. As days passed, His desperation became more visible. The tone shifted. The frequency increased. There was a subtle anxiety beneath his words. And yet, something important remained missing: responsibility. He wanted access, reassurance, closeness. But he did not yet offer accountability, consistency, or effort. Stoicism teaches that desire without discipline is chaos, and chaos cannot sustain connection. You were no longer impressed by attention. You had tasted peace, and peace raises standards. Once you experience the calm of self-alignment, emotional turbulence feels unnecessary. You realize that the version of him now reaching out was reacting to your absence, not responding to your truth. And that distinction changed how you saw everything. The power had shifted, but not in the way movies portray. There was no victory, no satisfaction in watching him scramble. There was only clarity. You saw that your value had not increased because you withdrew, it had always been there. What changed was your willingness to give it away cheaply. Stoicism teaches that self-worth is not something others grant us, it is something we protect. He may have told himself stories to cope, that you were playing games, that you would come back, that this phase would pass, but deep down, he felt the instability. The certainty he once lived in was gone, and humans fear uncertainty more than loss itself. This fear drove his search for your attention, your reassurance, your presence. Meanwhile, you were learning to sit with solitude without interpreting it as rejection. This is one of the most powerful Stoic skills: to be alone without feeling abandoned, to enjoy your own company without needing reflection from another. In that space, you became less reactive, less available for emotional bargaining. He wanted to return to the dynamic where he felt safe without having to change. But you were no longer the person who would accommodate that. You had stepped out of the role that made his life comfortable and your life heavy. And once that role is abandoned, it cannot be reclaimed. This is the uncomfortable truth. When someone panics after you withdraw, it does not automatically mean they love you. It means they miss the benefits of your presence. Stoicism demands honesty, even when it challenges our hopes. And honesty reveals that desperation is not devotion. You were not cold. You were clear. You were not distant. You were aligned. And alignment is threatening to those who thrived on imbalance. He searched for your love because he felt its absence. But you were no longer searching for his approval, because you had found something stronger: self-respect. The shift was complete the moment you realized that his reaction no longer controlled your decisions. Whether he chased or disappeared, you remain grounded. This is Stoic freedom: to no longer be governed by the behavior of others, to observe without attachment, to choose without fear. Now he wants to be near you, not casually, not loosely, but with an urgency that feels almost desperate. He wants to live by you, to orbit your world, to attach himself to your presence as if proximity alone could rewrite the past. He speaks differently now. There is more emotion in his tone, more intensity in his words. He wants to show up, to be seen, to be counted. But Stoicism asks you to pause here, not out of fear, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Because not every return is a revelation, and not every longing is love. What he feels now is the consequence of contrast. When you were present, available, emotionally generous, he did not feel the weight of losing you. Now that you are grounded, selective, and no longer reaching for him, he feels the gap. And the human mind does not tolerate gaps well. It rushes to fill them, sometimes with growth, sometimes with desperation. The Stoic does not confuse the two. He wants closeness now because distance revealed your value. But value revealed by absence is not the same as value honored in presence. This distinction matters. Stoicism teaches us to judge people not by their emotions in moments of loss, but by their behavior in moments of security. Anyone can feel intense when something is slipping away. Few can remain consistent when it is safely in their hands. You notice how his desire centers around you now. Your energy, your warmth, your steadiness. He wants to live by you because you have become a place of peace he no longer has access to. But ask yourself quietly, without drama, without ego, does he want to contribute to that peace? Or does he want to consume it? This is the question that separates reconciliation from repetition. You are no longer flattered by attention used to feel like oxygen. Now it feels like noise unless it carries intention. Stoicism reshapes desire by teaching us that what excites the ego often disturbs the soul. You feel his pull, but you are no longer pulled by it. That is the difference between attachment and choice. He may speak of change. He may speak of realization. He may say he sees you now. But Stoicism does not evaluate words in isolation. It evaluates patterns over time. True change is quiet. It does not rush. It does not plead. It does not demand immediate access. True change respects distance because it understands why the distance was created. You are not here to test him. You are not here to punish him. You are not here to prove anything. That phase belongs to the ego, not the Stoic. You are here to protect the inner equilibrium you fought hard to build. Peace is fragile when it is new, and Stoicism teaches that anything that threatens peace must be approached with caution, no matter how familiar it feels. He wants to live by you now because your life no longer revolves around him. You have structure, direction, a sense of self that is no longer porous. And this is what draws him back, not because he created it, but because he senses it. People are drawn to wholeness instinctively, but wholeness must never be sacrificed to satisfy longing. There is a quiet danger in being wanted after being neglected. The ego whispers that this is justice, that this is balance restored, that now you hold the power. But Stoicism warns us against mistaking power for peace. Power invites games. Peace invites clarity, and clarity asks one question only: does this serve the life I am building? Or does it pull me back into a version of myself I have outgrown? You have changed, not in ways that are loud or obvious, but in ways that are irreversible. You no longer negotiate your boundaries internally. You no longer explain why you deserve consistency. You no longer wait in emotional uncertainty. These are not preferences anymore, they are standards. And standards are not flexible for nostalgia. He may want access to your days, your thoughts, your future. But access is no longer granted by history, it is granted by alignment. Stoicism teaches that the past has no authority over the present unless we give it permission. Love that arrives late must arrive humbly. It must meet you where you are, not where you once were. You observe yourself closely now. You notice how your body responds when he reaches out. Is there tension? Is there anxiety? Is there a subtle shrinking? The body knows what the mind tries to rationalize. Stoicism teaches us to listen to these signals without dramatizing them. They are information, not emotions to suppress or indulge. He wants to be close because closeness with you now feels like safety. But safety built on your self-sacrifice is no longer an option. If he wants to stay, it must be without you abandoning yourself. And that requirement alone will reveal everything you need to know. You are no longer afraid of losing him. And that is why you can see him clearly. Fear distorts perception. Freedom clarifies it. Stoicism teaches that when we are no longer afraid of being alone, we stop choosing from desperation. We choose from principle. He may feel that you are distant now, but distance is not rejection, distance is discernment. You are not closing your heart, you are guarding it with wisdom. There is a difference. A Stoic heart remains open, but it does not remain unprotected. If he stays, it must be because he respects your rhythm, not because he wants to disrupt it. If he loves, it must be because he sees you as a sovereign being, not as a source of comfort. Stoicism demands a quality of presence, not intensity of emotion. You are not here to relive the past with a different ending. You are here to build a future that does not require endurance to sustain it. Love that demands suffering is not love, it is attachment dressed as meaning. And Stoicism strips meaning of illusion. He wants to live by you now, but you understand something he does not yet fully grasp. Proximity is not intimacy. Intimacy is built through consistency, restraint, and mutual respect. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced. It cannot be claimed through longing. You do not rush to decide. Stoicism honors patience over impulse. You allow time to reveal truth. You watch whether his actions stabilize or fluctuate, whether his presence calms or unsettles, whether his effort is sustained or reactive. Time is the ultimate filter, and the Stoic trusts it. There is no triumph in his desperation. There is only information, and information guides wisdom. You are not elevated because he wants you now. You are elevated because you want yourself enough to choose carefully. You have learned that love should not cost you your center, that longing should not demand self-erasure, that connection should feel grounding, not destabilizing. These lessons were expensive. Stoicism teaches us to honor the cost by never repeating the mistake. If he walks beside you now, it must be as an equal, not as someone seeking refuge. If he loves you, it must be with discipline, not urgency. And if he cannot meet you there, you will not be angry, you will be at peace. This is the Stoic victory that few speak about. Not being chosen, not being chased, but choosing yourself without resentment, walking away without bitterness, staying without fear, living without dependency. You no longer need him to validate your worth, and because of that, you can see whether he adds to your life or merely fills a void that no longer exists. Stoicism teaches that a full life does not beg for completion. If he stays, it will be because he respects the woman you have become. If he leaves, it will not feel like loss, it will feel like alignment. And that is the quiet power of Stoicism. You do not measure love by intensity anymore, you measure it by peace. And peace has become your standard. A Stoic does not rejoice in being desired after neglect. A Stoic observes, decides, and moves forward without attachment to outcome. You are not here to be anyone's lesson, you are here to live in accordance with your values. You were never meant to chase love or run from it, you were meant to stand still in your truth and allow what aligns to remain. And if he desperately searches for your love now, let him search. You are no longer lost,